Good morning, everyone. I'm Shannon Derejo from Creamer Media's Contract Publishing. Welcome to today's webinar on advancing South Africa's energy transition, hosted in partnership with EY Parthenon. Thank you to our sponsor, Mainstream Renewable Power South Africa, for their support in making this webinar possible. Before we begin, please be aware that we have enabled the Q&A function, so please post any questions into the Q&A box. You'll find this on the panel at the bottom of your screen. The panelists will answer as many of your questions as possible at the end of the discussion. To encourage interaction, we have also enabled the chat function, so you can network with the panelists and other attendees via the chat box. You'll also find this at the bottom of your screen. Please do not, however, post any questions in the chat box, as we may miss them. Post those into the Q&A instead. Please be aware that we are recording this webinar and will be sending the recording to you when it's available. We're also streaming the webinar live to YouTube, and we'll share the link in the chat once it's available. Today's webinar will be facilitated by Paul O'Flaherty, Executive Director of EY Parthenon Africa. Paul is an experienced CEO and CFO with a demonstrated history of working as an executive in the infrastructure, manufacturing, energy, and banking industries. He is also a qualified chartered accountant. Paul will facilitate the discussion with our panel, which consists of Andre de Ruyter, Group Chief Executive at Eskom Holdings, Dr. Tsakani Mtombeni, Executive of Sustainable Development at Implats, and Hein Reyneke, General Manager for Africa at Mainstream Renewable Power. Please be aware, though, that due to an unforeseeable diary clash, Mr. Andre de Ruyter is unable to join us live in the webinar today, but he has provided us with an exclusive 15-minute interview on today's topic, which will be flighted shortly. I'll hand over to our facilitator, Paul O'Flaherty, now to take the proceedings forward. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Shannon, and good morning, everybody, and a warm welcome to the panelists, Tsakani and Hein. Pity that Andre couldn't be here today, but be very interested to understand what his thoughts are. There's been a lot of move on this, since last year and before, and particularly in Europe. You see how the Europeans are driving their recovery from COVID through green investment and raising money to do that. But working back towards home, the government set up the Presidential Climate Commission that got operational in January of last year. When I've been speaking to them, obviously their first priority was to understand the nationally determined contribution and assist in landing that nationally determined contribution, which is significant new targets for South Africa to reduce its greenhouse gases 2025 going through in 2030, and we might touch on that. Obviously, we've got the Integrated Resource Plan of 2019 in play. Be very interested to hear from Hein on his views on that. So lots of dynamics in South Africa. We had COP26. It was called the Finance COP. And South Africa has a commitment that we will be provided the $8.5 billion. So very interested to understand that. But then, we get the energy intensive users who sit in the mining industry in South Africa. And we've got Tsakani to talk about that today. So lots of dynamics in this space. And, I said to Shannon earlier, we could talk the whole day on this particular topic, but let's maybe keep it a little bit focused. Nice to have the renewables represented here by Hein. So I think, Shannon, without further ado, if we can go over to Andre de Ruyter's interview. Thanks.
Greetings, Andre, and thanks so much for making the time to join Creamer Media to discuss the energy transition and Eskom's role within that. I'm going to kick off immediately at looking at your vision for the electricity supply industry. And now you're on record as saying that the global electricity industry and the value chain therein is evolving rapidly, and Eskom needs to adapt to the 4Ds of decarbonisation, digitalisation, decentralisation, and democratisation. How should South Africa and Eskom be responding to these changes?
Terence, the reality is that the world's largest economies, our trading partners, have embraced this evolution, and I think it's probably fair to describe it more as a revolution. Now, if we ignore these global trends And if we do not modernize our power system in keeping with these trends of the 4Ds, particularly coming out of the very negative impacts on our economy of COVID-19, I think we are just going to hamper economic growth in South Africa. We are going to fall behind from the perspective of addressing poverty, unemployment, and inequality, which of course are really systemic threats to the stability of our society. Electricity is the lifeblood of a modern industrial economy, and we have to keep pace with those international trends. So this means that in our opinion, we've got to implement projects that will rejuvenate an industrial economy to catalyze job creation and provide decent jobs, particularly in manufacturing. So we think that from a position today of a lack of energy security in South Africa, as is best evidenced by this terrible thing called load shedding, that we've got an opportunity for using this crisis as a pivot into a clean energy industry to build a new capacity, generation capacity, wherever we can, to address energy insecurity, to create jobs by smart industrial policies, and to enable us to address the very legitimate and well-founded fears of the just energy transition that exist in the coal mining and the coal value chain fraternity in particular. And I don't think we should dismiss those. So we think that there's an opportunity for us to develop capacity in Mpumalanga, specifically in the heart of the coal belt, where we've got existing transmission infrastructure. We've opened up some 36,000 hectares of land, and we are working rapidly to try and open that up for grid connections by investors using the 100 megawatt capacity opportunity. Mpumalanga's got the highest youth unemployment in the country, so a real opportunity for us to play our part and use this energy revolution as a pivot to address this. And I think that there will be direct benefits and also co-benefits if we implement such a plan. But I also think that we can't afford to wait. We have to now display urgency. We have to get moving. Otherwise, we are going to lose this opportunity and fall further behind compared to global trends in the electricity supply industry.
That really brings me to my second question is, what are the operational, financial, structural, regulatory and policy decisions that need to be taken immediately today to ensure that South Africa and Eskom are able to respond effectively to the changes and to take up some of those opportunities?
I think, first of all, from an operational perspective, we have to ensure that our current plant performs as well as it can, having regard to the age of the plant and the condition of the plant. But we all know that the Eskom generation fleet, with the exception of Medupi and Kusile, and if we get approval from the National Nuclear Regulator to extend the life of Koeberg, the balance of the plant really is either midlife or end of life. And we need to therefore address the looming generation capacity gap, which currently is at about 4,000 to 6,000 megawatts already, but we need to address that. From a structural perspective, Eskom needs to continue its legal restructuring. We've successfully delivered legal separation of our transmission business. We're awaiting licensing approval from NERSA. And I think that that's really a catalytic step in the right direction to unlock additional private sector investment in new generation capacity. But I think from a regulatory and a policy perspective, it would be hugely beneficial if we can get policy alignment and complementarity between four major policy streams: energy, environmental, industrial, and fiscal policies. There was a study done by Wood Mackenzie that states that governments who are committed to meeting net zero carbon targets generally promote a positive impact on the economy due to the investment and job creation that the energy transition brings. So I think if we can have an energy policy that recognizes the need for a greater role for market forces, to take account of the fact that our manufacturing industry, and particularly the minerals and motor industry, as well as our exported mined commodities, that these are at risk of carbon border taxes. So decarbonizing our electricity industry, I think, and supplementing the resulting gap will make us more competitive. And in fact, it will become, in my view, a sine qua non for participation in the global economy to reduce the carbon intensity of our economy. From a fiscal policy point of view, I think we do need to relook our procurement processes in particular. I've voiced my frustration with some of the very onerous requirements that add very little value in terms of governance that are manifested, not so much in the PFMA, but in the regulations and the practice notes attendant on the PFMA, also the triple PFA. But we do need to reduce reliance on government guarantees. And I think it's important that IPP investors should accept their fair share of the risk. There's no exceptionality for investors in IPPs compared to other industrial investors. Whether you build a factory that makes widgets or whether you build a solar farm, in my view, you should be able to take a view of the market and take investment risk and be rewarded for that risk. Furthermore, on fiscal policy, I think appropriate tax incentives, possibly subsidies, although I say that with hesitation, but support for example, special economic zones, which segues quite nicely into industrial policy, where with smart policy, we can drive additional local content. And I think we've got to be very strategic in how we do this. It can't be a brute force percentage requirement for local content. It needs to be a targeted strategic policy that first of all drives demand for locally manufactured goods, gives certainty of that demand for a sufficiently long period, and over time support local investors by appropriate industry master plans, specific policies analogous to the motor industry development plan, and also drive supply chain development. So as an example, we believe that electric vehicles are a very important part of driving demand for electricity going forward. However, we still have significant import duties on electric vehicles, and that leads us to a position where we don't have adequate local demand to justify investments in electric vehicles. So by first of all allowing demand to grow, initially satisfied by imports, over time segueing into a higher local content that will then drive local job creation and also keep a very important part of our manufacturing industry, the motor industry, globally competitive. If we don't have this alignment, I think we will have what Churchill said. He said, if you have 10,000 regulations, you destroy all respect for the law. So I don't think we should stifle the industry. We should enable the industry by appropriate and smart regulation.
And obviously we've got this backlog in investment, and the transition itself is going to require a lot of investment. What is the sort of scale of investment that we're going to need between now and say 2035? And what role is there for Eskom, the private sector and other stakeholders in rolling out those investments?
Terence, the numbers are simply staggering. Globally, it's estimated that the required investment in power supply and infrastructure alone is at $50 trillion. Now that's a number that I struggle to get my head around. But the alternative, of course, is that we have the catastrophic consequences of climate change, and that's why this is really something that we need to pursue globally. From an Eskom perspective, we require about $400 billion rand just in the next 13 years. And we want to apply that 400 billion rand to invest in about 8 gigawatts of clean generation options, bearing in mind that during the same period of time, we will retire about 22 gigawatts of coal-fired capacity. So we will definitely have a smaller role to play in the generation sector, which means that we want to encourage and incentivize and attract private sector investment to generation. And then we also need to strengthen our grid. We need to invest in about 8,000 kilometers of new transmission lines in order to access the best solar and wind acreage in South Africa and connect that to the market. We need to upgrade our grid. We need to build new substations. We require more than 100 new large transformers. We also need to upgrade our distribution grid and enable embedded generators to connect to the distribution grid. All of this requires a lot of money, and we will need to access climate funding, which I think after the $8.5 billion deal announced at COP, it is clear that we can access that, and it is available. But then we need to move with speed and we need to move with agility, all the while maintaining good governance.
So if government is able to convert that offer of 8.5 billion into transactions, what do you think that should be applied to? In other words, what do you think a just energy transition transaction looks like in South Africa, and what sort of template does it provide for the world?
From my perspective as the head of Eskom, I obviously want to access as much of that $8.5 billion as possible for Eskom. We have a pipeline of projects across generation, transmission and distribution that we can apply this money for. There are projects under consideration, for example, for the hydrogen economy, for other green transition projects. But I think it's fair to say that those projects are not nearly at the same stage of maturity as the Eskom projects, which are in some instances shovel ready and good to go. So we would really like to see that these transactions, and they will be probably different transactions, that they are implemented speedily and that we can start getting access to that money in order for us to avoid running into a time crunch like we've seen in the past with Eskom, with Medupi and Kusile, where we really started construction far too late and then made a number of mistakes in the process. So I think if we can put this transaction together, it's already regarded as an example of the type of concessional financing that rich countries are prepared to make available to middle income developing countries on the basis of commitments to accelerated decarbonization. So there's a quid pro quo, there needs to be a strict governance framework in place. And I think that that creates an exciting opportunity for this to be replicated all over the world. But again, to stress, there's no specific IP to this blueprint. Indonesia can copy it, Vietnam can copy it, and if we delay, if we hesitate, then those countries will gladly step into the vacuum that we create by inaction and take advantage of it. So the need for us to get our act together and really respond quickly and start serious negotiations, that we put those facilities in place, that we can access the funding is really important.
And then finally, Andre, if there was one thing you could magically command in 2022 to accelerate South Africa's energy transition and Eskom's restructuring, what would that be?
If we could have an integrated policy approach aligning energy policy, environmental policy, fiscal policy, industrial policy, so that we as a country can all pull together to make this transition into a lower carbon economy, that we can start to attract investors, that we can start building projects, that it's not only talk, but actual delivery on the ground, that we can create jobs, and that we can also start building those factories that will employ the people, hopefully all the people, and then some that will be displaced by the decarbonization as we move from a huge reliance on coal to a cleaner and greener energy future in South Africa.
Thanks again, Andre, for joining Creamer Media today to offer your invaluable insight. We wish you all the best in your efforts to turn Eskom around and to position South Africa's electricity supply industry for the future.
Great. Some very interesting thoughts coming through, and some good questions coming through. So Connie, I'm going to pose the first question to you. South Africa, none of this is new. We had the energy white paper in the 90s. In the 2000s, the policy was to split distribution into, the REDs, they called it, the regional distributors. We now talk about the unbundling of Eskom. We have an integrated resource plan, which has a specific trajectory of reducing the coal content of the energy mix from more than 70% to 44%. So lots of intent, lots of good thought. But when you look at it, Tsakani, major user of energy, you're at 24/7 production. You've got shareholders and investors. You've got communities who live and rely on you. You've got your employees. You've got your whole supply chain. How do you think about it? Is this doable? You split transmission. That's the system operator. That's the blood of the balance of the generation through the distribution. So when you sit as a corporate and understand what's happening in this space, how do you view it? How do you manage it? How do you make sure that you are delivering 24/7 production at Impala Platinum?
Sure, Paul. I think that the comments will largely reflect large power users' posture in the conversation. But first, let me thank Andre and his team for, I think, these increased levels of willingness to engage with stakeholders and being as transparent as they've tried to be in the last few years. But I think a huge congratulations for getting the unbundling conversation going. That is long overdue. Probably some 13 or 14 years behind since the first time this was introduced. I think the biggest challenge here is what you've mentioned, Paul, which is to do with our demand profile being 24/7. In mining in particular, it's very high in magnitude, but also relatively flat. And if you look at underground mines, they have a significant base load, i.e., we consume a lot of power even when we're not producing, because we have to keep the areas safe. We have to keep the areas ready to enter. But what I think is disappointing in the conversation at the moment is we've gotten into a technology tussle. We've forgotten energy security as an objective. Go back to the NDP. I think energy security appeared twice. That's how disappointing this conversation is. And if we zoom out and we look at everything that we have from IRP and all of that, and we start implementing these policies and getting our regulations in line, not preferring technologies, but look at what energy security the country wants to define. At country level, they have to cater for large power users. They have to cater for the small consumer, the bakery on the corner. But that's why they are good at policy making. From large power users' perspective, what we've seen in terms of what's viable, being a 24/7 profile consumption, is if you have the right mix, and I'm now going straight into the transition in terms of decarbonizing the energy consumption on our side. If you have the right mix of solar and wind, because of their complementary nature, wind stronger at night and solar obviously by day, with a fair mix and a great mix of energy storage, and as well as where you can have hydro schemes to provide that base. Those models that we've seen show that you can actually run the mine without having a need to burn coal electricity per se. But there are some key dependables for that to happen. I've already said you need energy storage. What we're seeing now is technology costs. Yes, they've broken through some barriers, but they need to get to that level where it can become a much easier solution to go to, particularly battery energy storage. And the second part, I think in the short term, while that technology is still coming to the level of affordability, I think we mustn't toss away gas as a transitional fuel, particularly for behind the meter applications. Yes, we do not have a fantastic gas infrastructure inland, reaching where most of the remote mines are, but I think gas provides a very strong transitional step for us, given that our current coal-based electricity intensity in terms of emissions is that high. What's also interesting with gas, Paul, behind the meter is it begins to position particularly large power users to tap into green hydrogen fuel in future. In fact, when you buy gas turbines today, you can specify dual fuel machines. So it's not only a transition in terms of the type of fuel, but also technology-wise, it's getting us there. It is worrying, Paul, that the energy security has taken a backseat, and we do wish that we could actually have the conversation at that level and let the economics, current and future projections determine what technology solutions at country level we should be embarking on to make sure that we keep the economic activity going.
Yeah, absolutely, Tsakani. Thank you for those insights. Hein, I'm going to move to you. EY, we did a survey late last year for the European Climate Foundation, and to Andre's point, we looked at the shovel-ready projects in the renewable space. You know, and we identified close to 18,000 megawatts of shovel-ready. You know, if all the regulations, if all the blockages were unblocked, that's the art of the possibility. Andre also spoke about the important part. Must never be forgotten that the transmission is what evacuates the power. It's no good just building the power station. You have to have those transmission lines. But Hein, you know, we've got an IRP, bid windows are coming out, but what Andre talks to and their conversion and the art of the possibility in South Africa, maybe the IRP 2019 is outdated. However, what is the capacity in the country? What is the expertise in the country? And how do we attract and maybe have a new chunk of renewables that needs to be added?
Good morning, Paul, and good morning, everyone. Yeah, look, the short answer is yes, the industry is definitely ready to deliver on the needs of the South African market going forward. In terms of the IRP 2019, it is due an upgrade at the moment. I think if we rerun the studies and look, the IRP requirement is actually an update every 3 years or so. So if we do run a new scenario, new simulations, I expect that we will see a significant increase for renewable energy deployment in a call it an IRP 22. So we're looking forward to an update on the IRP study. Maybe just going back to the industry. The industry, I mean, is more than a decade. The industry has been active in South Africa. Been Mainstream itself, we entered the market in 2009. And we are in a constant state of development. So new areas are being developed as we speak. Eskom has got grid constraints in certain areas in the Northern Cape and now the Western Cape as well. And you can see developers already running into areas like Mpumalanga, which is going to be crucial for just transition in the future, and other areas in the country as well. So it's not a case of we develop assets and then we stop developing and then we wait for the market to purchase it. So it's a constant development. So in the industry, it's delivered about 7 gigawatts to date. I mean, if you include risk mitigation, around 5, we'll go way over 10 gigawatts. It's a more than 100 billion rand industry. There's several players in the market. Majority of people working in the industry is South African. 100% of mainstream employees are South African, delivering on the future. And we've been able to recruit highly skilled people from all sectors of South Africa, from Eskom, from the coal sector, from the banking sector. We do foresee a challenge maybe in the medium term of getting enough human resource to deliver on this scale and demand that we foresee. But we see that as a nice problem to have, and it sees opportunity for the renewable energy industry to deliver on our obligations in terms of job creation and just transition forward. So in terms of financing the projects, majority of the local banks was local debt that finance the projects. There's a lot of foreign capital flowing into the market as well. There wasn't significant challenges in raising the capital by the local industry, and it just shows the quality of the local industry in terms of delivering what South Africa needs.
Yeah, thanks, Hein. Some interesting views there, and glad to hear. I'd be interested in the next question, about local content and those requirements. To Andre's point. Tsakani, you raised two very important issues that people think. Energy security is so key, and the gas, the gas opportunity, and in fact the RRP ultimately by 2030 talks about a 15% content of gas in that ultimate mix. But coming back to the energy security, and that's a risk for a 24/7 producer. So how do you think about investment? You have a reliance on Eskom to a degree. We know all the things that are going on. There's a lot of decisions to be made, a lot of so how do you think? How are you investing as Impala Platinum in this space to make sure you have an energy security for yourselves?
So, Paul, to start off with, mining industry it's a very capital-intensive industry and heavy infrastructure, and we invest for the long term. And so, with what I've just said, if number one, you have this transactional tweaking to policies and regulations. So now we're gonna exempt power plants up to 100 megawatts. And now we're going to allow land to be leased by private sector. One is looking for a plan that talks to long-term energy security that I can build into my investment model. I still don't understand why, by the way, 100 megawatts, because what we should really be concerned about is what are the technical requirements that the generator must meet? Set those and remove these artificial transactional barriers. They create a challenge, they create uncertainties, and when we are busy having to grapple with these uncertainties, investment decisions in mining have to be made elsewhere. And that for me becomes a bit of an unfortunate situation where the country could be cashing in like we used to. We used to have long-term, long-range planning. It used to be very clear. You didn't have to second guess Eskom tariffs. I sat through the NERSA hearings. Very, very difficult situation that we are having to deal with. So for some of the members, electricity input costs is already approaching 40% of input costs. They have to make decisions. Do they stay here? Do they move operations abroad? Those that can are able to divert their processing operations elsewhere. It's not so easy for some of us with invested interests and shafts in the country. So we really plead that sanity can prevail in implementing of policies that we have and making sure that we have a good transmission integrity that will enable all of this that Andre is talking about, because you have a mismatch where the mines are. You don't have wind, solar, and hydro and everything that you can start developing microgrids there. And so we would rely on the grid, and that's why the conversation on unbundling and creating this ITSMO ultimately, it's fantastic, because then it allows for a risk on the transmission to be played down, so that this company can focus on maintaining the grid, making sure that if I need to evacuate power from one end of the country to my operations or between my operations, that is possible. it is a bit disappointing that in all these conversations, while we're making these transactional tweaks, the bigger picture gets lost. For example, wheeling through the grid, that should not be a top secret thing that you go through so many offices to ultimately be told what you haven't done in office number 4. And the second thing is, I should be able to, in mining, there's a life of mine and there's always uncertainties. However, that should not stifle or should not limit my aspirations to building however big size generation plant. If I know I can always have a back-to-back agreement with another asset of mine or with another private player on the network. And this is where we are hoping that the new Eskom company, the transmission company, will begin to operate like. Someone said to me a while back that Eskom should actually become the Uber in the electricity sector. And maybe it's not too far off, because all of these tweaks that we're making, they are good in the short term, but I think in the long term, they may be cutting opportunities short there.
Yeah, absolutely, Tsakani. So, I personally think there's not enough debate around the transmission and the distribution side. What we're debating here is the generation. And I like your concept of sharing, amongst each other. The electricity pricing of Eskom, obviously I was on the other side of the fence, so NERSA is very painful for if you're sitting at the Eskom side as well. But that's another debate. Hein, maybe over to you on this local content. I mean, we're South Africans. We need to create jobs. We need to address the unemployment. We need to build industries. We need to make sure we're competitive and we're better than anybody else. But how do you balance it? To Andre's point, and how does the industry, the renewable energy industry, think about this?
Well, at first, the renewable energy understands our responsibility in terms of this opportunity to create local content, local jobs, and black ownership. And to date, the industry has delivered on all the requirements set by government in a procurement program, and in most cases exceeded the requirements and on all those different levels. What we do foresee, however, is that in terms of local content, so historically local content was a percentage-based hurdle that we had to meet. And in most cases, as I said, the hurdle was, we were able to exceed the hurdle. Just for example, for round 5, the hurdle for solar local percentage was 45%, and for wind was 40%. And the industry was able to achieve that. But what we've seen of late is, and it's maybe something that Andre spoke to as well, is that we see now a requirement for, which is referred to as designated local content, or which I like to call mandatory local content. That means that certain items in the value chains of wind and solar is mandatory local requirement and makes part of your percentage threshold. Now, as the industry, we don't necessarily have an issue with that, but we do foresee problems in the way the designated local content or mandatory local content is set up. Who decides what is local content and what is mandatory local content? And what we experience is that there's not really a big discussion with buyers of that designated local content or financiers of that local content. And a lot of power sits with the suppliers of that local content, which means that you may have scenarios where certain suppliers has got ambitions that they may not be able to deliver to. And we see that as a problem going forward. We don't necessarily think that mandatory local content is an issue. We as an industry, or as mentioned specifically, would prefer a threshold, a percentage threshold for local procurement. And that threshold needs to increase over time. And then we let the free market decide what is local content and what we can localize in the best possible way. If we need to go through a designated local content process, we need a much better process in terms of determining what is designated local content. We need all stakeholders to play a part in that, and we need to look at what is the bang for buck, so to speak. Local content do come at a premium. It is more expensive than imports in most cases. But I don't necessarily see a problem with paying more for it, or which ultimately increase the cost of the wind and solar energy. But it needs to be coordinated. We need to look at, which components will create most jobs for the lowest cost premium. And ultimately, so it's a very complex environment. There's very different opposing views on it. But at this stage, we are not completely satisfied with the debate or the stakeholder engagement around what is specifically local content. And that does not mean we don't support local content or designate local content. It's just the process needs to be smoother.
Yeah, in other words, all of the stakeholders getting an opportunity to have their say. So Connie, and not specific to Impala, but if you just stand back as a miner, Andre spoke about land being released in Mpumalanga, maybe create economic zones, maybe use that for growing industries around the renewables. But at the bottom line, the coal industry, the coal price, they're kind of shooting the lights out. And there's a lot of money in the export market that they can make, and you have this balance. You have this employment engine that we've always had, and now we have to go through this just transition. If you stand back and look at it, how do you balance this, Sekani? And I know it's not specific to Impala, but how do you think about it and what Andre is saying?
So I think the spike or the seeming spike in particularly in coal demand should not be a surprise, would have been expected as the discussions around the transition hots up. It's a global phenomenon, actually, that the IEA has even reported on. I think specifically for South Africa, this conversation is about should be about the just transition, not the rapid transition necessarily. And I think because we seem to be almost rushing, the plans that should be guiding us are archaic, very old. The IRP should have been revised every 2 years or so. There's new technology that's hitting new levels of commercial readiness, that the IRP as a dynamic document could be guiding that transition with obviously not only looking at the numbers, but also someone who will have translated the aspirations from Chapter 5 of the NDP into an action plan that says, Director or Minister so-and-so, you will do this by this day. That's your scorecard. So we don't jump into this new capital now available. Concessional funding, it's wonderful, but if we don't take this in a measured way and take everyone along the journey, okay? Consult the impacted and the affected. Yes, not everyone will tell you what you need to hear, but it's important that you take people along. That is a just transition. Have an understanding of you are delivering an energy system that has to deliver today, but it has to be future-proofed, okay? And as government, you're looking at supplying to a large mining company, a large light industry, as well as think about the butcher on the corner at some village somewhere. Okay. Now, that is what I think when you start looking at inclusivity in the conversation, I think that is when government can probably pick up speed on that. I know there's a lot of reports now being done, but I would like to hear some government minister or ministers taking ownership of an action plan that says we are going to do 1, 2, 3 by next year at this time. At this stage, we're talking. Andre talked about 22 gigawatts of coal that technically has to be retired. That is, by the way, almost half of installed capacity. Never mind that Eskom's installed capacity is not available in its majority. In fact, the only power stations that will be alive or will still be in existence the way we know power stations today will probably be Medupi and Kusile. Okay, I think we've now got a license to refurb the nuclear plant. So this conversation on the just transition, if we could slow down a little bit and have a actionable plan by those responsible and have something that we can, if it means we have to retrain, okay, our government communication machinery, so they speak the same language, please, let's do that. It is very, very difficult for private sector to interpret where policy implementation is going. If today you hear this, in fact, noon you hear this, by 4 o'clock there's another minister saying something else or another official. Let's settle that and let's take everyone along. This is not about the pace. Let's not make it be about the pace primarily. Let's talk about the just transition. This was ventilated at length, Paul, in the NDP. It amazes me that the policies that we're seeing today and implementation is no longer drawing from the NDP. Maybe that's a good starting point for the presidency to bring everyone and say, here's what the NDP says. 2030 is not too far, by the way, not even 40. Yeah.
No, spot on, Sekani, and I suppose that's what I, take the energy white paper. It's a great document. The NDP, as you say, this is not a new story here. You're getting a lot of good traction about your Uber model, which I think is right. Eskom as a service, that's right. The IRP. Now there was the IRP 2010 that we had some updates, and then the IRP 2019, Hein. 78,000 megawatts is the prediction of what we need in 2030. We're currently sitting around 50,000, but as Sekani says, it's not an available 50,000. So lots to be decommissioned and lots to grow. Shouldn't this be a program that is far more agile and flexible? Because Andre talks about them wanting to implement 8,000 megawatts of renewables. That's not even in the IRP. So how do you feel about it? Shouldn't this be the starting point about how do we get the IRP much better suited to an agile environment that we can flex it as we see it, given all the complications we're having at Eskom?
Yeah, look, my experience with other parts of the world is that these things get updated per annum, if not more frequent. So we need to be a lot more agile. And Logan, I think that this 100 megawatts, call it concession at this moment in time for licensing, will allow for a lot of agility in the market to be created. The IRP, to a large extent, influences government's steps and progress in terms of procurement. But what I foresee is that in the next decade, we will have private and public procurement of renewable energy, utility or distribution scale, to be two markets of the same size. And I foresee that the private market may even be larger than the public market. What we could see is that the public market would then start focusing on more kind of strategic procurement efforts, which is mostly related to a just transition. What we need is, and it's something that Andre mentioned as well, is that we need a merchant market where we are able to, as a sector and as an industry, move quickly. Not sit with current bureaucracy around wheeling, licensing, and it's some of the frustrations that Sekani has also mentioned. And we are able to trade energy across the market, and buyers and sellers know what the rules are. We can move quickly. We can ramp things up and down as required. And we don't go through this bust and boom process of round 5, round 4. I mean, the last time we procured energy in South Africa before risk mitigation was in 2015. So we had a 5-year hiatus where the whole industry was, developing assets in good faith and waiting for the market to buy again. So, and at this stage, we actually don't have a market. We've got a program. We've got a renewable energy public procurement program. We need a market. We need a market where fundamental market dynamics can take place and we can rapidly expand. And part of that market is something that Andre mentioned as well, is as soon as there's a market, the need for government or treasury guarantees will start falling away. Because financiers will look at it and say, look, if for whatever reason Eskom is not buying or paying, then there's a market. I can take my product to a market, and what's the value of that product in the market, and make decisions based on that.
Yes, thank you, Hein. I think that's valid. So Connie, you spoke a lot about you know, the bureaucracy in government, the accountability that needs to be driven. You know, we can't keep talking about these things. I found Andre's talk very refreshing. You know, they've got their eye on what needs to be done. They've obviously done deep thinking and thought about it. They work in a highly pressurized environment from not only just operational. It's going to be about goodwill. It's going to be about you know, government stepping up to the plate as well, and making sure that this gets done. Do you see that, Sekani? I mean, are you positive, and have you heard enough? Have you seen enough to you know, satisfy yourself that yes, we are going to have some movement in this space? It's very, very critical that we get into execution mode. Yeah.
Paul, I think we are beginning to make the right steps, albeit, as I said earlier, a bit transactional. But I think let's build on that momentum and see if we cannot create something solid. The market Hein is talking to is when it's clear to me who has to sink a shaft, what I will be paying for electricity. Please give me a cone to work with, okay? Don't do this transactional sort of approach. It doesn't help in large power users thinking. The other part is, you know, I think Minerals Council took a survey from 2018. We spoke to a number of large power users. We came back at the time with about 2 gigawatts of potential that we could add, large power users could add onto the grid. And I think that number is now approaching about 5 gigawatts. Okay, it's still too small considering the 22 gigawatts that Eskom needs to retire. So there are moves that we've made, but I think let's be pragmatic in implementation of policy. Okay, let's remove these ceilings that do not have technical merits. This 100 megawatt cap for the captive market, you know, and I must express here, I think, gratitude from the government program, because mainstream will not be talking to us the way they are. You know, some 15 years ago, that government program has landed expertise in this country, has made it easier now for the captive market to go after these projects. Okay, what will be helpful, Paul, is if there was a one-stop shop office for this project, similar to the RIP that you know, Hein and the colleagues have to go through. You go through the IPP office. If I didn't have to wait 18 months on environmental and wait another, I don't know, 6 months on going through other requirements, at the end of which I may still be sent to office number 2. Let's streamline all of that. So before I start, I know exactly what needs to be put in place. So I know when I enter the process, I prepare everything and get the projects going. I don't think it's too far off that the private sector in particular can play a significant role in plugging this gap, this 22 gigawatt gap that Andre is talking to. And I mean, if you look at where we are now, the consumption is not even at levels, you know, of great economic productivity. So it should be worrisome that the crocodile jaws ahead are going to widen and widen. That is where I wish we had someone in government who holds the pen to worry about that crocodile jaw and actually put things for the long term that help us to see how we're going to close that. That is how you get, I think, private sector to reinvest and support the journey forward. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Sekani. Hein, you know, we must also reflect and acknowledge here as well is that, you know, there's that great photo of the map of Africa at night, and the only light is shining on the north and the south. And Eskom has in the 90s and 2000s driven this access to all for electricity and just access to all. So it's not all about negative. But you've said it, when you sit in the renewable program, you wait on these bids. So you're very dependent on this program. And so if it wasn't that, you'd be then really dependent on the transmission plan. So Eskom has the transmission development plan, and the evacuation of the power is the most critical. Yes, you can build it, but what about the evacuating of the power? How do you see that dynamic if you move away from, say, an IPP program and now you're moving more to a free market? How do you see that transmission plan and that distribution plan being addressed?
Yeah, Paul, you're correct. Without evacuating or moving energy around the country, I mean, there's no, or the subcontinent, there's no, we can't access markets and we can't generate. So, firstly, from Eskom's transmission perspective, I think Eskom's transmission system is an absolute fantastic system. It's well maintained. Yes, there's shortcomings at the moment in terms of geographic location and capacity, but and I don't always think we all appreciate how big the Eskom transmission system is. I mean, it covers more than half of Europe. If you lift it and put it up there, so it's a significant asset that we as a country have. I think firstly, from a development perspective, you develop projects according to what the transmission and distribution system allows for. That's kind of the first tier of development. The second tier of development is then to start, as what Andre mentioned as well, that we need to then start building lines into areas which would give us low cost renewable energy from a wind and solar perspective. And that's well recognized and well understood by everyone as well. So that's kind of a second phase coming in the future, but that obviously requires lots of capital and resources. We still in the first phase. Yes, we do have constraints in certain areas in the country, but there's other areas in the country which doesn't have a constraint, and you can see the industry is moving into those directions. Even if it doesn't have the best solar resource like in Mpumalanga, if there's grid available compared to a project which doesn't have any grid, then the project with grid is always going to be your lowest cost. So there's lots of movement in that direction as well. But in terms of call it private sector distribution, we do foresee, and that's what Tsakani is also mentioning, a lot of the big energy intensive users are looking at projects behind the meter or in close proximity to them, which will then allow for private sector grid over short distances and do it behind the meter as well. So yes, grid is crucial, and it's going to be something that we need to monitor and watch, but we're still in this first phase of matching development to what available grid is.
Thanks, Hein. I think we're nearing the end, Tsakani and Hein. So, I get positive out of these conversations. People are thinking about solutions. People are thinking about collaboration. People, it's not always about pointing fingers at everybody else. It's about what can we all do to make this happen. So Tsakani and Hein, briefly in 30 seconds, I'll probably give you the question that was given to Andre. If there was one thing that you could magically wave your wand that you believe needs to be done soon, Tsakani, what would that be?
Paul, thanks. I think for me will be to get the IRP spruced up and actually create a system to keep it dynamic, so that we can make sure that we constantly improve and meet the energy demands for the country. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Tsakani. And Hein, from your side?
Look, I think it's been said by Andre and Tsakani, and I'll repeat it as well. We need a clear set of non-complex rules of engagement, which was developed by all stakeholders, so that everybody understand clearly in terms of generating, wheeling, trading, access to grid. And that's the only way we're going to deploy renewable energy at scale and ultimately deliver on a just transition going forward.
Yeah, thank you, Hein, and thank you to the panel, and thank you for everybody who dialed in today. This is a collective problem, and we will find collective solutions. And we do have an Eskom that has actually created the country we sit in. So these are just another set of challenges that we should overcome. So thank you to everybody. Shannon, I'll hand back over to you.
Thanks so much, Paul. And that does bring us to the end of our webinar. So I would like to take this opportunity to say thank you to our facilitator, Paul O'Flaherty, for enabling a robust and engaging discussion. I see the chat was very busy today. Thank you also to our panelists, Andre de Ruyter from Eskom Holdings, Dr. Tsakani Mtombeni from Implats, and Hein Reyneke from Mainstream Renewable Power South Africa. Thank you to our strategic partner, EY Parthenon, and our sponsor, Mainstream Renewable Power South Africa, for their support in making this webinar possible. And finally, thank you to the attendees for taking the time to join this discussion on advancing South Africa's energy transition. We hope you found it engaging and informative. The final webinar of the series, Upgrading Infrastructure for Economic Growth, will take place on Friday, 4 February at 10 a.m. The link to register for that session has been shared in the chat, or it will be. The recording of today's webinar will be sent to you in due course. And if you have any additional questions, please be in touch. You can reach us at shannon@creamermedia.co.za. Thank you for your time. Stay safe and stay well, and goodbye.